Most nationalisms are not like that. Most nationalisms are not violent, and if they were, nationalism wouldn't be so powerful. The key point is that national experience has always been defined by this, by routine. So the point here is that the state territory has become so sacred, so ingrained, that it's not questioned now. Today I'll be talking about very much on the basis of this book that has been published recently, Nations, States and Nationalisms, with Polity from Political Sociology series. And in this book I tried to kind of develop long-term argument, which is a sort of a distinct way of understanding the origins of nation-states in relation to previous forms of social organization, particularly empires, city-states, city leagues, and so on. And I also look at how nationalism has become dominant ideology in modernity and what's happening with nationalism. So this particular presentation today focuses on one aspect of this argument. So it is a long-term, broader argument, and because people are generally more interested in what's happening now, so I'm here to provide a crowd pleaser in a way to focus on what's really happening with nation-states and nationalism today. In sociology, I think there is a kind of mainstream general view that nationalism is passé. It is a thing of past, that we live in a globalized world. There's that focus on multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism. On the other hand, also the revival of religious fundamentalism has undermined a lot of these studies done in the 90s on significance of nationalism. And then there is also that view that nation-state is being surpassed by alternative forms of social organization, European Union being one of them, but also more regional type of organizations. So what I try to do in this book, but also in this presentation, is to make a case that this is really not the case. If you look at what's happening with both nations, states and nationalism, is really that they are transforming rather than dying. And the fact that nationalism is less visible, it's less aggressive, less violent, is actually a sign of its strength rather than weakness. I want to make three arguments about this. First, I will argue that the distinction between the hot nationalism, the kind of more violent nationalism, and the banal nationalism or habitual is not straightforward. It's not, in many respects, it's conceptually problematic and empirically not sustainable in many cases. The second point is that I contend that this everyday nationalism cannot be firmly distinguished from the official nationalism. It's not a kind of rigid polarity that one kind of can assume. In part because there is no causality between nationalism and violence. And the third argument that I want to make is that proliferation of everyday form of nationalism is not a sign of its weakness, it's actually the sign of its strength. And that's very much linked with the expanding power of the state and other social organizations, big powerful corporations and many other things. So the first point that I want to make is that banal nationalism is not a only Western phenomenon. It's not something that happens only after the Second World War. It's much older. It's in many respects the dominant way of how nationalism has always operated from its inception in early modernity. And this is the way how it proliferates, how it captures the attention of the majority of the population. Often nationalism is assumed to be violent. I've written an article recently with the title, "Is Nationalism Inherently Violent?" where I argue that it's not, and then I try to develop an argument why this is not the case, why we perceive nationalism as being linked with war and revolutions and other things, but in most instances this is not the case. When you think about nationalism, obviously the images that come across quickly, are battlefields, and from Delacroix paintings, you see the great battles, to Hollywood blockbusters. It's always martyrdom, it's bloodshed, it's battlefields. But most nationalism is not like that. I mean, this is most forms of nationalism are kind of unnoticeable. The Billig's point about what matters is less the flag that is waved deliberately, but one that hangs unnoticed on the public buildings. Kind of that sense of normalization, habitual acceptance of images that we take for granted, but that we use, banknotes and stamps on the letters, and weather reports, and all these small things that matter. My second point is that the firm distinction between the official, the formal and informal, or banal personal nationalism is very difficult to sustain empirically. There is no question that nationalist ideology appears in so many different guises. So there is no one nationalism. And I talk deliberately about nationalisms rather than nationalism. Some of these nationalisms can be mutually exclusive. Denmark would be a good example of a state where nationalism, the official and the popular nationalism, developed along very different trajectories, in part because Denmark lost territory to Germany, and the ruling elite was delegitimized in that sense, so you had this kind of alternative nationalism. But in most instances, there is a lot of overlap between the so-called official nationalism and the informal nationalisms. In a sense, I don't dispute the view that official nationalist messages can be very different and have very different local resonance, and they can be often subverted and distorted and even ridiculed by the civil society groups. So that happens. It's very much the case. The fact that in the late 20th century and early 21st century, we witness much greater proliferation of mundane expression of nationalism is not a reliable indicator of its novelty. It is really this direct consequence of the broader organizational and ideological changes. The people now have more, there are greater literacy rates, there is more technological development that allows people to be exposed to various contents, the technological advancements in communication, transport, printing, mass educational systems, Gellner's point, the presence of maps. We learn in schools, we envisage the world through these maps that Anderson was talking about. Well, before there was it's only elites that understood the maps, were able to read maps. Now we all can conceive the world in these terms. We know where our nation is and how it looks like on the map, and you can pinpoint it on the globe as well. And in most contemporary, but also historical contexts, such banal manifestations of nationalism cannot be interpreted as a simple, spontaneous, bottom-up activities. What I argue is this is very much linked to organizations, particularly state, but also civil society and many other groups. In this sense, the experience of both hot and cold expressions of nationalism are similar, because they were transmitted in the same way. They depend on organizational infrastructure that has to be there in place. So I talk about these organizational vessels for development of this habitual nationalism. Educational system, mass media, political parties, but also civil society and many other groups. So the organizational vessels for development of hot and cold nationalism are essentially the same. It's not that banal nationalism comes out of thin air. It comes from the same sources as the official nationalism. The message could be slightly different, but it has to rely on what's already there. So even the most radical civil society groups have to work in the world that already exists. They cannot create a world from scratch. They can contest, they can subvert, they can reinterpret existing nationalist frames, but they cannot create completely new interpretive frames outside of the world that is already there. So they need publishing houses, they need universities, they need schools, they need courts, they need mass media, they need so many other outlets of public sphere. They need internet providers, who can be controlled and are controlled by the states, as we could see more recently in US, and we knew about China and many other places. But precisely because nationalism is not so rigid, it's not so inflexible, it is able to adapt, to metamorphose. That's the whole point about nationalism. It doesn't appear in the same guise. 19th century nationalism is not the same nationalism that we experience today. So saying that nationalism is flexible ideology does not mean to suggest that its plasticity has no bounds. There are limits. We are all born in nation states, whether we like it or not. In a sense, it's not possible for us to escape. You can switch one nation state for another. You can have a passport of more than one state, but it's impossible for you to exist in this world without some sort of a nation state attachment. And that's the world we live in, that sense of a structurally embedded nation states, which kind of galvanize ideology of nationalism in many respects. So what I'm saying essentially is that the borders of the nation states are not questioned in the same way as they used to, precisely because the nation state is become normalized in a way, taken for granted, assumed to be the case. Okay, so now what I'm arguing is when we look at what's happening, in relation to nationalism, rather than they fading away, the story seems to be the opposite. We have more nation states today than ever before in history. We have more nationalism in terms that, according to various surveys done, most populations seem to be more identifying strongly with their nation states than less. So this doesn't really, again, mean that they don't identify with other things, but it doesn't mean that nationalism has disappeared. So what I'll be talking about for the rest of this talk is really this habitual nationalism and the way how it works and what is distinct in a sort of a dialogue with Billig and others who have written extensively about this. Then thematic Hollywood productions that glorify a particular nation, films such as Braveheart, Michael Collins' Independence Day, and so on. This specific museum and artistic exhibitions, there are Terracotta Army, for example, various paintings, Italian and many others. Idealized tourist destinations, Taj Mahal, Connemara, public festivals, Oktoberfest and things like that. All of these things are small, less visible. They're not very, they're not violent, but they project certain image of a particular nation that we recognize instantly. Even if you look at the less nationalist symbols, like more international symbols, such as 1st of May, the Workers' Day, here we again nationalist variations on the way how this holiday is celebrated. So we have different national flowers. The workers used in Austria carnation, in Germany red rose, in France poppy. So it's an interesting thing that even something that is seen as truly international has a very national interpretation. So the point is that banal everyday nationalism is very powerful, and its power comes from its organizational embeddedness and its organizational might, in a sense. When people are secure in who they are, they don't shout. They're not kind of focused on convincing others. You don't have to say, "I'm Austrian" a million times, because it's quite clear where people are. Aggressive expressions of nationalism are often a sign of insecurity. So that's the key issue.
I was surprised you said that habitual nationalism was that nationalism was for the most part habitual from the inception. Mm-hmm. And that sounds quite awkward, because something is habitual from its inception is kind of contradiction to it.
Yeah, I mean...
But that was not my main point. might make one. Wouldn't it be necessary to distinguish between an early form of habitual nationalism and a more mature? Because all these examples, like of beauty pageants and World Cup and Eurovision Song Contest, these are quite recent.
No, I mean, when I say it's a habitual from the beginning, there is no kind of a 0 point where nationalism starts. I mean, it is a long-term historical process. So what I'm saying is that our focus has been very much on these moments in time, the violent revolutions, you know, the French and the American and many others, rather than looking at as how this process has developed. So you know, kind of, I'm kind of overemphasizing that to some extent to say that the practice of how nationalism was practiced in the early days, let's use that phrase, was more habitual than violent. You know, that's the point that I was making. It was a much smaller group, you know, because it was an elite and later on middle class groups that were nationalists rather than majority of the population, as we know from Eugene Weber and others. You know, even in France, the majority of people didn't see themselves as French. So it is also about the size. You know, we're talking about much smaller groups, and now we are talking about entire societies. You know, so that has changed. So I'm not arguing that nationalism doesn't change. I especially deliberately emphasize that it changes, it metamorphoses, it transforms, and that's why it's more powerful now. So, some of these, you know, elements that I mentioned, the beauty pageants and all of that. Some of them are more recent, but they're just recent articulations of something, you know, that, you know, I've given also examples of these things that have, and I have many more in the book, you know, which existed in the late 19th century, you know, the mass production of things. So it's, you know, the form might be different, but the substance is there. It's just oriented to smaller groups. Then now it's a mass market. So, you know, there is an element of change. Yeah, you might be right in a sense that we can distinguish, you know, and talk about differences between the two, but for me this is the same sociological phenomenon. You know, it appears in different variations.